In our conception of name, image, and likeness, in many ways, we thought that this was going to mirror what we see in the pros. What I learned very quickly in this role was that that wasn't true for a lot of reasons.
Hey everyone, it's Steven with the NIL show and Campus Inc. back for another episode. It is week 4. Is this our 4th episode, guys?
Week 4.
We are with the NIL team at Campus Inc. Adam Cook, Sean Ellenby. Guys, how's it going?
It's going great. We finally got some sunshine and good weather in Chicago, which I feel like I have 2 different versions of myself. There's good weather Chicago and bad weather Chicago. So feeling good.
Things are great. Softball is heading into the postseason right now. Baseball is going into the postseason. It's the best time for spring college sports. So it's a lot of fun right now.
Sean, you're getting married soon.
I am getting married soon.
How's the preseason? How's the preseason?
Preseason is going fine. We're working through the kinks, but no, we're enjoying it. Trying to enjoy the process through it. But I think we're 6 weeks out now. I got the bachelor party in 3 weeks back in Ocean City, Maryland. And once I get through that, I think it'll be very real.
You're getting married in Maryland, right? In Baltimore?
I'm getting married in Baltimore, yeah.
So planning a long distance wedding. If you think a long distance relationship is hard, plan a long distance wedding.
Yeah. When we originally planned it, we were still living in Baltimore. We didn't think we'd be planning long distance, but certain things happen. So it'd be good to be going back home.
Career change, planning a wedding, moving from higher ed to the private sector, working in the NIL space. It's been a year for you, Sean.
Yeah, some things have happened, that's for sure. I didn't quite have a baby like Adam, so it's not totally life-changing. But yeah, a lot of things have happened. But it's all good stuff. Like, it's all really good stuff. And we've enjoyed every step of it. And yeah, the private sector is kind of fun. There's a little bit more, I don't know, when you're working in the public school area, there's a lot of rules, a lot of things that you have to abide by. Private sector it's kind of fun, a little bit more of a challenge, but more fun.
All right. So we have an awesome guest today. Kam Cox from the University of Illinois, easily a thought leader in the NIL space. We've gotten the pleasure of working with him. But before he comes on, guys, what's new in NIL? Tell us about what's happened in the last week.
There is a lot new in the NIL space. So within the last week, the NCAA released some clarification of language around NIL and activities that were allowed and not allowed. Sean wrote a great piece about just what it means for college sports. Once again, does it have any impact on what we're doing around merchandise? Absolutely not. But it's been really fascinating to see a lot of school and universities' reactions around what the NCAA has said. The long and short of it is they re-clarified what booster activity is and who qualifies as a booster. They named all of the collectives as boosters, and so put out some language around kind of reminding people what they can and cannot do, and also said, hey, we may retroactively go back and look at some particularly egregious activity in the collective space. So good things there. I think a lot of universities were interested or maybe even hoping for them to give a little bit more clarity as we barrel down this like arms race of NIL stuff. I think people were kind of hoping for a little bit more from the NCAA, but I'm sure it'll come soon. What's new on your side, Sean?
Yeah, I would just say what's cool with us right now is references. I think we knew this going in. One of our most powerful tools in terms of spreading the good word would be references of our athletes and telling their friends how their experiences are here at Campus Inc. So Mac Leonard's been an all-star for us so far down at Florida State.
Had an all-star weekend.
Yeah, that's right. She had an amazing weekend. She just basically won the ACC title for Florida State. But one of her good friends that she actually played softball with at ISU in her club days, Morgan Day from Oklahoma State, just signed with us. And then another teammate of Max, I think we're going to end up signing as well. And she's not the first athlete that has certainly been a reference for us in signing athletes. So I love that. That's what you want, right? You want your athletes to be having a great experience and telling others and sharing the good word. So it's awesome.
Sean, tell us about Keely Rochard and what's going on there. Big history at Virginia Tech.
Yeah, Keely Rochard, pretty cool. First co-licensed athlete in Virginia Tech history. So it's pretty special.
We have a very, very special guest with us today. We are joined by Kam Cox, who oversees the Influence program at University of Illinois. Kam joined Illinois in 2021 before joining the athletics department there. He was in New York City as a practicing lawyer at two of the most prestigious firms in the country, Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett, as well as Covington and Burling. He has a lot of experience, not just in the legal side, but in the athletics department as well. He's a graduate of Auburn University, graduated from Vanderbilt with his law degree, so he is no slouch in this space at all. So we are really, really excited to be joined by Kam Cox at University of Illinois. Thank you, Kam, for joining us.
I'm glad to be here, Adam. I think I need you as my hype man everywhere I go.
That's good.
No
Adam.
pressure to answer this stuff correctly. I'm glad. I'm glad to be on here and glad to be able to kind of talk a little NIL with you boys.
I was just going to say, like, why the heck would you leave New York to join this wild west we call NIL? Tell us about your journey into the space.
Well, it's because I knew everything in the world might be possible. I'll say when I practiced securities law, for a lot of the good things it taught me and a lot of the benefits it gave me, I mean, the truth is that the framework of the securities laws was built, I mean, at this point, we're coming on about 85 years ago with 33 Act, 34 Act, and to some degree, 40 Act. Obviously, it's changed in its regulations since then. Think about, SX, SKD, those kinds of things in terms of the regs. But the very first NIL laws went into effect only about a week and a half after I started, right? So this is the equivalent of actually being able to really build a plane as you fly it, to think about where it should fly, how it should fly, if it should be flying at all, maybe it should be a boat, right? Those are all the things that we get to kind of figure out right now, and to be kind of on the front line of that and have an opportunity to be a part of that decision-making process in this intense period of disruption for college athletics. That's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and you really can't turn that down. So I think when I was presented with it, it was one of those, hey, how fast do I get there before Josh Whitman changes his mind? One of those kind of things. So I'm glad to be here.
Kam, how unique is your role? How unique is your role within college athletics offices in terms of, have you seen other universities with the same role that you have at this point yet, with similar backgrounds? I feel like offices have been all over the place in terms of the backgrounds of the people that they're hiring in NIL positions. What have you seen from your vantage point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say, I don't know if I was the first one, but I was one of the very, very early kind of NIL specialist types of folks. I'll say that our athletic director, I think, is particularly forward-thinking and a bright guy, Josh Whitman, and he led the industry in saying, hey, look, NIL affects trademarks, it affects marketing, it affects compliance, it obviously affects student-athlete education, it affects fundraising. We need somebody who can just jump right in the middle of all that stuff, right? And I think before there was a concern that, well, let's just make it a part of somebody's job. And what we saw across the country was several athletic departments try to do that. And then they realized, wait a minute, this thing is way too big to be done effectively as just a part of somebody's job. It needs to be someone's entire role. And so as a result of that, we've seen an increase in my types of roles. And so I know like Tennessee hired somebody. I know Memphis has somebody new. I'll say that there's a position posted for Purdue. And then there's one other one that I saw posted, Kansas State, just the other day. So there's actually kind of a lot of us now and a lot of us coming, but I think that there will be space for even more. And I think there's a real advantage to not really looking at somebody who has a particular background. I mean, I have my skill set, but I'll say there's folks I talk to all across the country that I have a lot of respect for, and they come from totally different backgrounds, right? Because in as much as this whole thing is informed by state law and it is helpful to be a lawyer, this all has to do with student athletes. And so maybe it's helpful to have a background as a student athlete. Also has to do with connecting communities. So maybe it's helpful to hire somebody who is kind of a hometown lady, right? Like those kinds of things are the things that you have to think about as an athletic department, because what we're finding out in NIL, and it's no different with NIL hiring, there's more than one way to skin a cat here.
100%. And you're in a really interesting position at University of Illinois because, like you mentioned, they were very forward thinking in the way that they wanted to approach NIL and their interaction with it. And also, I think, pretty wise in kind of predicting where it would go, all of the different factors it would impact, while simultaneously being in a state that has historically had some of the most restrictive legislation around NIL activities as it relates to the schools, athletes, as well as businesses. So how has that been for you, being at this super progressive institution that is in a state that's kind of holding back on things a little bit?
Yeah, so I'll give a little context because it almost is a contradiction without the context. So what happened was, and a lot of people may not know this, the NCAA, kind of leading up to July 1st of 2021, the NCAA put forth proposed legislation around name, image, and likeness. And it was a robust kind of package of legislation. It was the culmination of several months, I guess over a year of kind of working group analysis and all this kind of stuff toward the end of 2020. Right there before NIL was set to go into effect, the Alston opinion came out. And when the Alston opinion came out, what happened was the NCAA started to kind of just question its ability to regulate student athlete compensation in kind of any way, right? And so a lot of that legislation fell away. What does this have to do with our state law? Several of the early state laws, think about Alabama state law, think about Florida state law, think of South Carolina state law, think of our state law, think of Mississippi state law, I can go on and on. Several of those early state laws were drafted as essentially a codification of that NCAA legislation to try to create what would have been a national standard just existing in several states. You can almost think of it as, the speed limit. The speed limits are on the highways are actually regulated on a state-by-state basis, but we all kind of agree it should be somewhere between 65 and 75. That's basically the way it was supposed to work. What happened was when Alston came out, they basically said, hey, there's no speed limit. And then folks who hadn't had a speed limit said, well, wait a minute, I think we can go 100 miles an hour. Mm-hmm. And so what we did, kind of being forward thinking, was on the front end say, okay, let's make sure our student athletes have access to their right of publicity and can actually monetize their NIL. Let's put forth a law. And then it was like, oops, we found ourselves in kind of a bad spot. And then it started to become, okay, how do we make sure our student athletes still have opportunity? And so we were really the leaders of efforts to try to amend our state law, because something I saw very quickly when I got into this role was, wait a minute, not having that background in college athletics, it hit me from day one. So much of the student athlete experience is tied to their support, the resources, and really just the counseling that they receive from the athletic department. And so it was one of those things where, hey, if you're having a hard time in class, what do? You get a tutor from the athletic department. If you need to figure out, okay, you just get to campus, you're a young lady, you're 18 years old, where do you live? Talk to the athletic department. If you need to improve your game, of course, talk to your coach, talk to the athletic department. But then when it comes to this whole new space, this opaque thing that no one's ever had the right to do, this question about like, how do you leverage the new platform? You have all this stuff. Now you can't talk to the athletic department. It kind of doesn't make sense, right? And so what we saw very quickly was there's an appetite from the student athlete for us to get more involved. But what we also saw, and I kind of made this very vocal in some of the earlier conversations we had, is that in our conception of name, image, and likeness, in many ways, we thought that this was going to mirror what we see in the pros. What I learned very quickly in this role was that that wasn't true for a lot of reasons. One, most of the people don't have agents, and that's a big thing. But two, is that the nature of student athlete celebrity is derived from their relationship to the institution. And so the market for student athlete celebrity is also connected to the institution. And so you kind of have this weird scenario under our law and, those laws that I mentioned a minute ago, where basically you've got people who really like the institution, you've got athletes who are really connected to the institution, and the institution's kind of out of the whole mix, right? And in a lot of ways, we've saw that, hey, this didn't make sense. And for that reason, all of those laws that I listed have now been amended or repealed.
Right. And, it's, again, in our conversations and as we, here at Campus Inc. talk to different universities and student athletes, I mean, our experience across the country is exactly that there's this appetite that the athletes have of this desire for the universities to be able to assist them, because that's been that relationship for, as long as we can remember. And now all of a sudden there have been these big blocks in place. And, as a former athlete and coach myself, and now working on this space, it's a little bit frustrating. You want to pull your hair out. You're like, you as a university are there with the intention of assisting the student athlete in this transition from whatever, high school to the professional world, amateur sports to professional sports, whatever it may be. Your purpose is to assist in this transition. And all of a sudden now your hands are tied. And so it's been really great to see what you're able to do University of Illinois. It's been able to see other institutions begin to kind of spin this up and really embrace that role of we can help you navigate this in a way that's going to be successful for us and you, and really do this in the way that it's intended to be done.
Cam, my question is, like how much time, obviously you're spending time educating and offering resources to the athletes. And, we see that Illinois is really taking a progressive approach at like education and resources. How much time do you spend educating legislators, like, and educating Springfield and being like, because we're learning about this. I wonder how senators and legislators are really, thinking about this. Is a lot of your time spent like teaching them and telling them what's needed?
I would say a good bit of my time is spent on educating the people who can make changes, be it legislators, be it, people who are kind of in our lobbying apparatuses, University of Illinois, be it people who are in other lobbying apparatuses, that kind of stuff. I mean, I'll say one, I want to correct myself earlier. I said that Florida state law was amended and they moved to amend it, but it was not actually ultimately amended, just to clarify that for anybody listening. But I say that to say, like, educating people on the status of our law, of other laws, and why that's important is a big deal because our representatives, they're like really busy guys. I mean, this is the biggest thing in my world because I am the NIL director. But at the end of the day, this is a child's game, right? This is amateur athletics. And, we consider, and we'll talk about how it's becoming a bit more professionalized and things, but like this is not, the war in Ukraine. This is not inflation.
Right.
And this is not, some things about, curbing violence, like things where you're like, okay, wait a minute. Let's all kind of take a step back here. And so I do have to spend quite a bit of time succinctly delivering information to people who can make a change. I mean, I've spoken to our representatives on a state level and even folks on a national level for the purpose of kind of making changes that we want to see. I mean, because we're always focused on kind of the NIL law, which, like I said, comes at a state level, but there are national laws here as well that there has been lobbying efforts to kind of try to change up. But all of that is about kind of getting it on people's radar. And the truth is, I don't know if y'all know, this is an election year. And so because of that, it's even tougher. But that doesn't stop our efforts because one thing about our industry is that in this part of NIL, in terms of particularly when it comes to kind of involvement of institutions as it relates to these opportunities, when it comes to the accessibility of NIL for international student athletes, when it comes to kind of federal records protection as it relates to kind of student athlete information, freedom of information as it relates to student athlete NIL deals, like there's consensus on those issues. And that's what makes them different than some of the harder stuff that our legislatures have to get through. And so a lot of times what we do is we have to explain to them, like, it's not that I'm proposing some new thing for our state law. It's new to you, but this is kind of where the market is now. Or it's not that, when Oscar Sheboy sat down with Mitch McConnell and talked about what we need to do to change the visa laws for international student athletes to take advantage of NIL, that he was proposing something that I hadn't proposed or, our international student scholar service hadn't proposed. It's just, it needs to get on Senator McConnell's radar, right? And so there's that kind of stuff. And I'd say I spend more time than I would have thought doing that, but it's always really worthwhile.
I love what you said about it being ultimately we're in sports. And as I was used to work in the athletic department, I would always remind people like, look, guys, we're working in sports. This should be fun. We're not curing cancer here. Let's find a way to make this fun. So I love what you said there. I'm curious when athletes, when they have, especially, or I guess in particular, Illinois athletes, if they have a contract that's sent to them, can they take that to you and you look over and say, I think this is good for you or not good for you? Or what are the rules in the state of Illinois in terms of how much you can help from that perspective?
Yeah, so it's really nuanced. And that's the kind of thing we want to be able to get more involved with. Particularly I do, just because, my background as a lawyer. What we do is we educate. So a lot of times when student athletes get these contracts, they say like, what is this? Or what does this term mean? And sometimes it's, okay, you just need to read it. But more often, it's actually a legitimate question. I mean, I'll say one of the early questions I got was from one of our wrestling guys said, what does this section mean? And I was like, well, what section are you talking about? And it was like, section 2A1. And I'm like, okay, what is it? And so I look, and it had to do with the FTC requirements that basically you say hashtag ad or hashtag sponsored. And I thought, I can totally see why you wouldn't know what that is. And so I was kind of able to educate. So I can do that. I can explain to you like, well, the indemnification provision is saying, if you do this, you're still going to be on the hook for it. And the flip side is if they do that, then they're going to be on the hook for it. Or, well, this governing law provision says that this has got to be governed by Illinois. And that's really important because remember, NIL laws change state by state. What I can't do is say, oh my gosh, dude, this termination provision is ridiculous, right? I can't do that. What I can't do is say, oh, you're only getting 10%. Well, so-and-so's getting 20%, right? Like that's what I can't do. And so that hamstrings me a little bit. I think it's also hard because to some degree, as you educate, you want to push a little further and be like, well, this is what this term means. And you hope that they realize, and that's a terrible term, right?
Yeah.
But I think one of the things you got to remember about young people, and that's the thing, these are young people, is that they don't know where market normally is. So I can tell you, well, there's all these miscellaneous clauses, and they could say, well, we should just get rid of that stuff. Well, we can't really, it's not a big deal, but we can't really get rid of it, right? But even there, it's like, what am I giving legal advice, right? So there's this whole question about how involved we're really supposed to be. And I think that, I've been telling people this over the last couple of weeks as I've had a chance to speak on this stuff. I think the question about the appropriate level of involvement for an institution in a student athlete and a third party's business endeavors is really the central question of all of NIL. When we think about what's going on in the collective space, when we think about what should the NCAA do, even when we think about stuff like how to advertise for it, even the education, like all of that is really wrapped up in that same kind of central theme.
Yeah, it's so interesting what you said there. I remember one of our coaches, he was talking to me. He said, I can't believe our guy took that deal. And I was like, Coach, 2 months ago, he was making zero. Now he's actually making money. He doesn't care what the deal is. He's just happy to make money. And so I keep saying, I think a year later now into it, I think college athletes are going to be a little bit more savvy when it comes to signing deals.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's one of the things about, like, one of the most important things in every state law and every institutional policy has to do with disclosure, because I have to know what's going on. And I can't just get that from headlines, which are sometimes misleading and sometimes they want to get out and sometimes they're not true and all this other stuff. I have to actually see, okay, look, if you are a part of our men's basketball program, the market generally would be interested in you doing this thing for this amount of money. If you're part of our women's basketball program, it's a different amount of money. If you're part of our football program, it's a third amount of money, soccer and tennis and swimming and everything else. But I have to have some sense of what it is, because what I'll also see is, well, this person's a part of our football program, but they're local. And so maybe they're earning a higher compensation. They're earning something that, well, that's looking like quarterback money right there, right? But I remember, well, hey, this kid's from Muhammad, right? And so it becomes a different thing. But I have to be able to kind of gather all that. And the worst thing in the world is that after you have all that information, and to the extent that anybody does after these 11 months of this thing being into effect, then next thing you know, you've got someone in softball who walks up to you and says, hey, is this a good price? And your lips are sealed. Mm-hmm. And you're thinking, generally, yeah. And that's one thing that's been good. I want to be clear about that. Like, the market has been very, very kind to, I think, our student athletes and has been very fair. But in the event that they're not, I really want the ability to be like, this is ridiculous, or don't do this, or what? No, just let me redo it for you. And so there's a real concern around kind of being protective. But on the other hand, they're adults, right? As much as they're young people, they're adults. And the whole foundation of this thing is student athlete autonomy. And so even as we're able to get more involved and whatever, one thing I'll never do is actually set the price for student athletes, because to me, that's up to them. It's very important. It's the core of what we're trying to do here, is make it where they have to set their own prices and they have to care, right? And so that's a part of that stuff too.
Yeah, it's almost like your career services. Like I remember going to college and being like, hey, these are the companies I want to interview for, and like, can you look at my resume? And like, there is a demand for professional development. And this is professional development. It's real life coaching. You are a coach for them for their business endeavors, but your hands are also tied, right? Is that where you think like agency plays a role now? Because there is a demand for the students to get help, right? Like, they need the help. They want help with contract negotiation. They want help figuring out their prices. Doesn't that just create a sector for agents to come in and be accessible? Like, how do you feel about all that?
It does. And I'll say that, the agents that I've kind of heard about anecdotally across the country and here at the University of Illinois have actually been very, very good. I think the problem is that student athlete compensation is generally much lower than professional compensation. And so when you talk about getting your 10%, 15%, 20%, I'd take 20% of $1 million before I take 20% of $100 any day. And that's basically the problem, that the market for agents isn't that great because the opportunity is not that lucrative. And that's something that we got wrong really early on. I mean, you look at these state laws across the country, particularly some of the older ones, there's all this ink that's spilled talking about agents this and agents that, and agents have to have this qualification, and agents have to do this thing, and all the agent contract. And you look up and there's no agents. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm thinking even more like that gap's there. And if the institution can't fill it and the agent can't fill it, then it's just a gap. Mm-hmm. And when there's a gap, then things get missed, right? Because things can land too far in the gap. And that's basically what the problem is. I mean, I think there is a real opportunity for agents. We're seeing an increase in kind of uptick in younger agents, like folks who maybe aren't as experienced. But there's trade-offs with that. Like every agent that you get can't be, the world's most powerful, the version of Ari Gold that we all remember from Entourage, right? Yeah. But you probably want somebody better than just, a sophomore who's in the same business class that you are, because how do they know more than you?
Well, and that's real too. I mean, I chat with agents regularly, and I am always a little surprised sometimes. Like I get an email and it's, I'm working with so-and-so agency, and it's an at Hotmail or something like that, or an at university.edu, and then schedule call and say, I got class at this time, and I'm like, sorry, that's not what I expected when you said you were an agent. But that's a great, there is this opportunity now for this new. This new kind of class to come up, and you mentioned that there's a gap there. If that gap gets filled in a productive and a helpful and a competent way, then that's a wonderful thing, right?
Absolutely. But you got to fill it in a helpful, productive, and competent way. And that's what's difficult, particularly right now, because there's a lot that goes to this stuff. I mean, if you're an NIL agent, my first question is, hey, do you know the NIL laws? Okay, then do you know the rules associated with that? Actually kind of what's come out of those laws. And then it's do you know the market? Mm-hmm. Can you actually drum up opportunities? And you're hard pressed thus far in a brand new kind of space to find somebody who can confidently say yes to all three of those questions. Mm-hmm. It's just hard. It's just really, really hard. But it's better than the alternative, which is a student athlete having no help without an athletic department that can assist them. So we've been fortunate in that sense.
So you talked about kind of some gaps. You talked about some changes, and one of the things that has been absolutely shocking to me is for the first 10 months of this, how silent the NCAA was as a governing body, and how much they intentionally removed themselves from a lot of the conversations where you would expect them to be involved. That changed a little bit this last week around, them putting some publications out around, re-clarifying some NIL bylaws and what have you. I'd love just to kind of get your off the cuff. I'm not going to lead you any direction. What did you think about that statement from the NCAA, the clarification on the NIL laws? What was your kind of first reaction as an athletics department representative?
Yeah, so let me talk out of both sides of my mouth like a good lawyer. On one hand, it wasn't a big deal. Reason being, it essentially just added more color on the rules that already existed. Didn't put forth any new rules. It didn't add really anything that we didn't already know. I think it was just a more forceful version of what we do know. I also think that it came at a time where the toothpaste is a little bit out of the tube. And so there's this sense of, okay, what can this really do? Is this enforceable? Everybody knows the NCAA is afraid of legislation, of litigation, I guess, and also legislation, which we'll talk about later. But all of that kind of made it where this isn't a big deal. On the other hand, Adam, this was a huge deal because the NCAA actually stepped up and said, look, we're going to enforce the rules that we have. I'll tell you a little story. The biggest thing that ever happened in NIL, and no one really talks about this because it's such a small thing, was that later in the fall last year, the NCAA announced that they were investigating BYU, Miami, and Oregon as it related to a couple of NIL things. And what came out very shortly thereafter was that the investigation was cursory at best and yielded absolutely nothing. That kind of mismanagement and miscommunication around that mismanagement combined with the early signing day is why you're seeing the Wild Wild West now. Mm-hmm. I like to say all the time, it's the equivalent of, you're in college and say you're at a frat party and the police show up and they say, turn your music down. Now, this thing can go one of two ways. What happened in the fall was essentially the the NCAA said, you know what, actually, no, you have the right to be in this house. You can play your music as long as you want. And then everyone turned their music up, right? And so what happened Monday was that the NCAA came back to the house and said, no, you need to turn the music down. And we're not leaving. And now there's this sense that, well, maybe we do have the right, maybe we don't, but they seem to be real serious this time. And so I think what we're seeing is that in this world where institutional appetites have consistently pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed, there's finally starting to be this wall. And we're saying, look, you're not going to be able to just push as much as you want. There actually are rules. You can actually get in trouble. And there's a concern that the police might show up here.
And Cam, that's really like, let's the elephant in the room is these are around collectives, right? And inducement, right? What has your experience been seeing collectives? Like every day I hear about another one that's being spun up. For those listening that might be part of a collective or are part of that world and in the booster world, like what do you have to say to them? Because you're seeing it on the higher ed side, the legal side, like, I don't know, what's your take on them?
I like collectives. I like collectives a lot. I encourage people to get involved with collectives. I encourage people to contribute to collectives, but I encourage collectives to do their business the right way. And when I say the right way, first off, I mean, create a legitimate infrastructure. You see a lot of these collectives that are put together kind of in a haphazard way. They want to make a splash. That's it. I also say do right by the student athletes. If you love your school, yeah, make sure that you're whole in terms of your time and your sweat that you put in there, but don't make a profit from it. That doesn't make you a collective. It's like kind of a business that's really taking advantage of the student athlete at that point. But I like the concept because the foundation of kind of institutional programming is really donor support. That's everything from, our soccer program to our law school, to our business school, to our engineering, all that stuff. It really works because people who care about it have an opportunity to show how much they care by putting their money where their mouth is. And because the institutions aren't paying student athletes, the collectives give people an opportunity to do that and to feel more engaged. And this is another front of engagement, right? And so I really do support what collectives are doing. I think that obviously I don't support recruiting inducements. I don't support them speaking to recruits. I don't think there's any place for that. I think that, that's something that really has to stop. Particularly because it's not in the best interest of your school. I mean, I think a lot of people will be like, yeah, whatever, you can say whatever you want. But it's not in the best interest of your school. I mean, you don't have as good of a sense of what's going to happen in the future to your programs, and you shouldn't be the one guiding that. Like, that's part of the trust that you put in your coach. I mean, can you imagine a world where, Coach Underwood, who, won these trophies sitting here behind me, told me this is what we should do in the future. And I said, no, coach, you need to recruit this other kid. Like that's insane, right? Like, this doesn't make sense. So I think that's a part of why you should just wait until your guys and girls are actually on campus, but keep on at it.
Isn't it funny how sometimes boosters have a bad connotation to them? It's so, because without boosters and donors, your athletic department literally cannot exist. I mean, student athlete scholarships are funded by those donors. They are so massively important. They care so much about their school. And so I love what you said, because I think collectives are getting that same bad connotation. And I love what you're saying about, no, collectives can be used for good. Let's just do it the right way.
Absolutely. And there is a way to do it the right way. I mean, I think there's a competitive pressure to kind of like get ahead. And anytime there's competitive pressure, there's pressure to kind of cut corners. And that's what I see a lot of these collectives doing is, hey, why don't we just cut a corner by announcing that we're going to pay a certain amount of money in the future. Hey, by the way, we don't have any of the money yet. Or why don't we just cut a corner by signing somebody to a deal that could pay up to a certain amount of money? Hey, there's no indication that we're going to be able to pay that amount of money. And there's also a lot of questions about how we would be able to do that and whether it's tied to performance, like all this other stuff. Or you can go about it the right way and say, look, let's actually garner support. Let's show people in our fan community that we're about the right thing. Let's pool this money. And then because we have those relationships with student athletes, let's work with the ones where it makes sense and create something everybody can be proud of. And I think there are some that are doing that too.
Yeah, and it's kind of, you hope it democratizes a little bit of the access around the fandom and the affinity to the program, right? That's what we love, whether it's your alma mater or not. If you ascribe to a particular fan base, what a cool thing to be able to say, yeah, I'm a part of this collective that is directly contributing to this university or institutional success. I'm helping out, athletes who have been struggling or having a difficult time making ends meet. But, what a great thing to be able to contribute and say, no, like this is really a we, right? Like we are actually doing this, which is a really neat thing.
It is. It is very cool. And what a great thing to be able to get involved with it. I would encourage people, if you see your collective, you believe in it, like get involved. There's plenty of space because mainly the collective space is made up of volunteers. So you can volunteer your time too and kind of deepen your connection and affinity in that way.
Cam, how does, now let's bring the word transfer portal into the mix.
Uh-oh.
Right? Do you think, and for listeners, before, recent legislation is you don't have to sit out a year, right? Do you think there's going to be legislation around when you can take NIL money if you are entering and transferring? Because when you include transfer portal and NIL, like the word inducement is it's a very hot word right now. Do you think there is going to be legislation around that? I've read a couple opinions in both directions. What are your thoughts on it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the problem is the foundation of NIL is not the world that we live in right now. For the world we live in right now, there's this question about how can you possibly allow kind of NIL to exist in the context of transfer portal. They're basically the cocktail of problems that we're dealing with, right? In the world that we conceived, in the world that will always exist in the NIL space, in the part that's about student athlete autonomy and the right to privacy and like kind of the whole concept that student athletes have a platform they should be able to monetize, I don't think it can be tied to transferring at all, right? You look at the Cavender twins and you say, well, why would they lose their Boost Mobile deal from going to Fresno State to going to Miami? It seems like, honestly, it might get even bigger. Mm-hmm. Or you think about some other high-profile people and you say, well, their celebrity is really not tied to the school in the sense that it would not be able to be replicated in another school. I think that's really kind of going to be a business choice. So from a business's perspective, I think about my favorite local ice cream shop is called Jarling's Custard Cup. For anyone who's ever been around here, it's delicious. If Jarling's is working with, Andre Curbelo, who's on our basketball team last year, it makes a lot of sense. We're here in the Central Illinois community. Jarling's is tied there. He's a member of the men's basketball team. Andre decided, hey, I think my fortunes are better off at St. John's. He transferred last year. Jarling's doesn't have a whole lot of use for Curbelo right now. It has about the same amount of use for Curbelo at St. John's as, my favorite bagel place up there, Zucker's, did in New York when Curbelo was here in Champaign. Basically none. And so I do think there's a real value to doing it that way. But I think that when you think about it from a student athlete rights perspective, it's hard to take away. I think your point is well taken, though, that we can't have this world where, you can use kind of recruiting inducements of current student athletes through the transfer portal. And I think we have to do something to stop that. I think NIL is not necessarily the vehicle of doing that. But I also think that people need to get more comfortable with the idea that student athletes are going to move around a lot, right? Like, one, there's a lot of opportunities. There's a fierce war for talent. Two, that's the same trend we've seen in the pros, right? Like, in some ways we talk about like, oh, student athletes are moving around all the time. And I think back and I'm like, didn't we already go through this with LeBron James and the decision and all that, right? Like this is a new world we live in. And I've talked about this on many occasions. These are young people. Mm-hmm. So they're actually people and they're also young. And what we're seeing right now in the transfer portal, that's no different than what we've seen in the Great Resignation and just the Gen Z war for talent. Like that's how that works, right? And so I think people need to appreciate that, look, student athletes are going to move around a lot. At the same time, we're actually trying to run a competitive endeavor here. And so maybe being able to move around 4 times in 4 years is not ideal for that, and it isn't. But getting comfortable with it and saying, all right, there's going to be some movement and we're going to have to find a way to restrict it is a different thing than saying, all right, we're going to have to use NIL to do it, because I just don't really think you can.
Yeah. And that, there's a lot there, right? In terms of a competitive market, in terms of, the trends that are happening and what is mirrored at the pro level being reflected in the collegiate level, not just on the court, but also, on the quote unquote business side of it as well. There's a ton to unpack. And that kind of brings up another point of this institutional goal at the end of the day of pushing athletes towards degree completion, right? Like that's the purpose of an institution's existence is to bring student athletes and students to a point of completing their degree. And that's another hot topic around that transfer portal. Is this helping or hurting the degree completion of student athletes? And just recently, as of I think today or yesterday, we saw California putting forward a new bill around this kind of, pay for play, profit sharing, revenue sharing direction that they're moving. It's
a complicated one, isn't it?
Yes, it is. SB 1401 for those of you who care about those types of things and want to dig a little bit deeper. But essentially, what California is saying is that they will pursue revenue sharing for student athletes, and then they will put that revenue into a fund distributed throughout the 4 years of the athlete's time at the institution, that they can use that money, and that's supposed to be a way to encourage them to complete their degree.
Adam, we're talking TV deals. Like talk to me about when you say revenue share, what all goes into that?
Yeah. So broadcast deals, ticket sales, the revenue and profit that's generated from the athletic programs would then be distributed back to the student athletes. And it would be distributed in a way, I mean, you can look this up. LA Times had a great write-up on it. I saw it on Yahoo News. You can look up some of the details on it. And Cam, maybe you can even speak a little bit more intelligently than I can. But it would be a 50-50 share, essentially. And so there's a lot of conversation around this bill being, the bill that kills collegiate sports, which I think is ridiculous. People are just looking for clicks on their on their ads or on their articles. But I'd love to hear just your thoughts on that bill in particular, Cam, because you said there's a lot. It's complicated. There's some interesting things happening here.
Yeah, it's complex, and I won't even endeavor, particularly so early on, to speak too much to the complexities of it. But a couple things I'll speak to. First of all, for listeners out there, I want you to understand that the history of student athlete empowerment has generally started with California, be it at Urbana at UCLA, be it the Alston case, be it the Fair Pay to Play Act, the first NIL law,
And so California was the first state to actually change the NIL legislation. They changed it in 2019.
Correct. And so I sometimes teach this, but that's a part of the story, is that there's kind of a common theme of people who believed they could, right? Like people, and it's kind of the same people keep showing up in this story. So I say that to say, don't think, oh, that's California. You know what? They just pass stuff out there and this will never catch on. It will, says the NIL director, right? Like it can.
Yeah.
I think that it can be reworked and there's other things, but it's legitimate and can catch on. I think what it does, though, is it accelerates a train that is starting to move. And there's a question about how quickly it's moving about, okay, are student athletes going to earn wage compensation from institutions? And then the more important question, which is how much, whom, and in what capacity, right? The devil's always in the details there. How workable that is with respect to what's being proposed out of California most recently, I don't know. And I won't seek to opine on that because I can't quite see the future. But I think what this is doing is it's pushing us toward a world where we say, okay, let's figure it out. Because just like name, image, and likeness, the first law went into effect in 2019. It was 10 years before when Ed O'Bannon first made his challenge, right? Or I don't know when it'll come that student athletes may actually be earning wage compensation. But it won't. Whoever says that won't be the first person to say it, right? It's not a novel concept. And so there's this idea that, all right, what's happening there, what's happened in the Johnson case, what's happened in a couple other instances is actually pushing us closer and closer to a world where instead of just saying, is it going to happen? It gets us to that harder part of let's figure it out. Right. And so I think saying let's do it in a revenue sharing model on some hands, I like to say, on one hand, kind of makes sense. You're like, hey, these are the people who are generating it. They should share in a part of that revenue. That's how most jobs work. On the other hand, you say, well, this isn't really like a job, right? I mean, in a lot of ways, the benefits that come with a job, like steady pay, we all like that. But other things that come with a job, like accountability to our employer, we don't like that as much. Generally, that's not seen as favorably. I think that, we put on institutional program for the purpose of helping out young people, for the purpose of helping out students. There might be a way that we can do that in the context of wage compensation, whether it is through collective bargaining or the employee-employer relationship or something else. I don't know.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's not built for this structure.
And I think so many, there's a lot of, NIL is a very polarizing topic and people feel very passionately one way or the other. And I think the thing that is really important to remember in conversations about this is, this bill, as an example, is not intended to push forward that perspective or the idea that student athletes should be seen as employees and would be given a compensatory wage in return for their performance. But I think there is a little bit of, hey, we need to think about moving this direction holistically, but you can't just snap your fingers and all of a sudden that happens, because what happens with conference alignment, what happens with transfers like we've just talked about, what happens with somebody gets hurt and they lose their ability then to continue performing as an athlete. Traditionally you would keep your scholarship, which is great, but if you're not on a scholarship and you're getting a wage as a result of your employability, now all of a sudden that changes things. So there's all of these, when you begin to peel back one layer, you reveal like, this onion is a lot bigger than, maybe the news makes it seem to be, or ESPN Around the Horn makes it seem to be at first.
Absolutely. It's very, very complex. I mean, and, I like to always remind people that, in the 50s, when we started paying out athletic scholarships, we kind of created this legal fiction that is the student athlete. It's kind of the classic, I know it when I see it. But there really aren't a lot of correlates in our legal and employment structures that are like student athletes, like the relationship they have in terms of, what the compensation is, how the compensation is restricted, the fact that it's not taxed, like all this different stuff. It's kind of a special set of rules made for a special group of people. And so to anyone who kind of thinks they have the silver bullet, I always would encourage you to be wary about kind of potentially trying to put a round peg into a square hole, because in a lot of ways, that's what we've been doing since the 50s. And if we kind of work within our existing structures and not trying to use all our ingenuity that we can.
So a question for you, Cam. I'm curious how closely you work with the coaches. I come from Maryland. Maryland does not have anybody in your position currently. I think they're scrambling right now, just to be frank, with trying to figure out NIL and get their hands around it. And our coaches are beating down the door of our compliance office saying, hey, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? And I know our compliance office is kind of spinning right now, saying, I have a job to do. This is a totally separate job, and it's really taking up my entire time.
Right.
So how closely are you working with coaches on a one-to-one basis?
Very. I mean, so for one, I'll say, I mean, to what's going on in Maryland, Damon, Cody, like those guys do a great job over there. So it is a tough road to hoe, specifically when, it's not the entirety of your role. So that's thing one. I'll say thing two, I work very closely with our coaches because to me, I still kind of thinking like an old lawyer. I like to say a coach is like a client. I think about it as these are the people who run the programs that my job is to assist those people. I think the most important thing is really being proactive with those coaches, educating them about kind of what they can and can't say, what's going on across the market, and then kind of helping them think through what they might want you to achieve in terms of results, because coaches have different goals, right? Like coaches may say, well, you know what? I want to make sure that every player on our team earns the exact same amount of money. You say, okay, well, when I'm educating, businesses or we do open houses and that kind of stuff, I'm going to want to speak to a little bit more of the egalitarian nature of it versus if there are coaches who are saying, I want the 2 stars on the team to earn all the money because I think that's the best way of us advancing our program. I say, well, you can't really do that. But generally the stars on the team are the ones who have the best social media followings and things. Mm-hmm. And so I say, okay, well, let me work with that team to make sure that the social media following can be amplified to kind of create even more segmentation, right? That kind of thing. But you really want to have your coach's appetites because, again, like I don't have that same relationship with our student athletes as our coaches do. I have a good relationship with several of them, but it's not like our coaches. And so I want to make sure that I'm not trying to kind of be in the background playing God of saying, well, this is what I think should happen, and this is what I think we should do at the University of Illinois and the NIL program. The truth is that every decision that I make affects our coaches and our student athletes. And the other thing our coaches do is because they're closer to our student athletes, they know them as people, right? So one thing our coaches will say all the time, people never talk about this, but is they'll say, I don't want our student athletes doing a ton of stuff during the season. Mm-hmm. And you're like, yeah, but that's something fans don't really think about, right? Because they don't have to interact with them in that way. But yes, it's really quite a to-do to say, okay, hey, we're playing a football game against, Minnesota on Saturday. It's Thursday night. Hey, would you mind coming over here and making an appearance for 3 hours? Just like, well, yeah, kind of, because I have class tomorrow and like I have to leave in the middle, right? Like there's all this other stuff. And so we really are trying to be really focused on that, but it's the coaches that help you stay grounded there, because it's easy for me to get caught up in like, okay, what's going on Twitter? What's going on in legislation? Mm-hmm. What's going on in the business world? How's ESPN talking about this today? What's somebody else's coach saying? Without saying, no. These are the people that you're here to serve. These are the people that you're here to help. And these student athletes are the ones that you care about. These ones right here at Illinois. And the coaches are the ones who help me focus on that the most closely.
That's super, super insightful. And I think it's really critical to understand the life of a student athlete and just how busy it is. Sean went through it a couple of weeks ago, and it's fascinating, but it's inspiring. Kam, just to wrap, what are you most concerned about? What are your next challenges and endeavors? Like, we've made it through, I feel like this is Jumanji and it's like level 1 complete, Yeah. What's on the horizon for you and the challenges and what you see coming in the space?
Yeah. I've gotten that question a lot recently, and I still don't really know what the right answer is, to be honest. I'll say off the cuff. I think the challenge is going to continue to be the same thing that it's been from the very beginning, which is that critical question I alluded to. What is the appropriate relationship between the institution and the third-party business endeavors of its student athletes? And the reason that question is going to become more of a challenge is because the back half of that, the third-party business endeavors of student athletes, is going to grow, right? And so on one hand, there's a sense that, look, this whole thing is about autonomy. And so if collectives want to really juice up the numbers, if people want to start, transferring for that reason, if players want to start demanding retention bonuses, all that other stuff, like, what is your role in either making that happen or not happen? And as we're looking to change our state law, I think that's a big question that I have for myself. Not just what can I do, because there's so much flexibility in the space. You can do pretty much anything if you have an institutional appetite. But what should I do, right? It's a question of, okay, if one of the girls on my soccer team comes to me next year and says, hey, I think that I want to take this deal versus that deal, but I know that, I trust these guys more than those guys. Like, should I tell her that? Right? Like, is it up to me to tell her where we should go? Even if she asks me, how much information should I give? Like, those kinds of things are really hard. And I think those challenges are actually going to even get harder because more people are jumping into the space. I think they're also going to get harder because bigger businesses are jumping into the space. So another thing people haven't forgot about is, there are entities like Campus Inc. that were really, really forward thinking, or like, hey, let's get on top of this, right? But there are a lot of entities, because NIL didn't go into effect until the middle of 2021, that they didn't have their 2022 budget ready yet. And so there's this sense that, well, some of the really, really big players are going to start to move the needle in this space. And when those players start to act, it's going to become a whole nother game, because then it's going to become a situation where you're saying, well, I could see a world, we're not talking about Custard Cup anymore. Say we're talking about, I don't know, Dairy Queen, giant that is. And it's every student at this school, or every student athlete at this school has a deal with Dairy Queen. Right. And that's a big deal. And then you start to say, well, that sounds like money that's going to come for a really long time. And that sounds like the school getting very, very much in bed with Dairy Queen, which may be good, maybe not. Right. Right. And so there's all these questions about what is the right relationship when that happens, and how do we actually manage that? And how do we say, look, stuff as simple as, hey, here's your Dairy Queen deal. You have the same one that everyone did for the last 4 years. to things that are like, hey, don't eat Dairy Queen every day just because you can. It's not good for your body, right? Like there's all this stuff. And the question is like, who says that? And that's stuff that I continue to work through and continue to think through like ways that kind of question is going to be answered. But that question is the same one that we dealt with, when it came to collectives and to what extent collectives should be involved with this stuff. It's the same question that we dealt with when it came to group licensing. And when we thought about like kind of the group era of NIL, when everything was like the team deals and everything was about kind of getting people signed up for Brander. And it's the same question that we honestly dealt with when institutions were putting forward the state laws, right? I mean, you think about the people who really pushed the state laws that came out of California, like those were activists, right? That was like Ed O'Bannon, the usual suspects. I mean, the folks who pushed the state laws here, I mean, that's University of Illinois, right? And so there's some question about like, well, isn't this the one who was trying to stop the law for a long time, right? So all of that is wrapped up in that same central question. And as that question continues to morph and manifest, I'm here to try to figure it out. But if you guys have any tips or tricks, please do let me know, because it's a tough space and we're all trying to just wade through it together.
Well, we appreciate this, and it's evident you're a thought leader in the space, and the university must feel super fortunate to have you on the staff. And it's just been impressive and to work with you and everything thus far. So, I'm sure listeners might reach out for tips, tricks, or whatever. But just to say you're doing an amazing job, and it's pretty awesome to see what you all have done. So we'll have to do this again at some point to see what all has changed.
I'm sure it'll be totally different by then, and I'd be glad to do it. I mean, I'll say you guys are doing a really good job yourselves, and I want to commend you not on the job you guys are doing on the business side, but also as kind of being leaders of the space. I mean, I think, to your point from earlier, Adam, there's a lot of polarization, and it's one thing for me as somebody who's paid by the University of Illinois to say, hey, this is great. It's another thing for businesses who have not only kind of found success, but accelerated their success through student athlete name, image, and likeness to come in and say, hey, this is great. So I want to commend you guys for doing that and for getting the word out.
Thank you. We've got a lot more work to do nonetheless, but great people like Adam and Sean keep our wheels moving. So this is